once again,
We back?
you're speaking too much truth to
I know. Bono's
what's going
really
on.
getting
Bono is
agitated.
not going to stand for this. Mark Blythe is now
Um,
shutting us down.
so I think especially for American listeners who are watching this, they'll kind of get this, right? If they remember the 2008 financial crisis, they'll remember this. That, because the same thing was kind of done here. Um, the people were the problem, right?
Mhm.
Not the Wall Street banks. Yeah. They over leveraged, they borrowed too much money, they went on
Mhm.
too many holidays in the sun, in Ireland's case, in the Mediterranean, right?
Mhm.
They put extensions on their homes, they remodeled, they were basically living the life,
But there was a lot of
and
growth too at the same time. I was reading
yeah,
your
there
paper
was,
and
but it was
Steelers.
debt fueled growth.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key issue, is that the again, we have to understand that the banks had been quite deregulated. And the growth was transformative. I mean, we have to understand that even in the months immediately preceding the 2008 crash of the Irish stock market, um, which is roughly synchronous with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in New York. Uh, Ireland's debt ratings were good. Ireland's growth prospects were very strong. Ireland did not have a lot of national debt, and this is a kind of an interesting contrast, actually. The Greek economy had a crisis around about the same time,
Mhm.
and it's an interesting kind of comparative study. The Greek crisis started as a sovereign debt crisis. The Irish crisis ends up as one. Because
Mhm.
it's what the government eventually has to do is step in and nationalize the major commercial bank, Anglo-Irish Bank. We can talk more about that if you want. And it has to basically cover the debts of all the other major banks, credit unions, etc. The whole sector just collapsed. And there were there was very little debate around this at the time. There's some sort of controversy about, uh, you know, some people wrote letters. Like there's a guy called David McWilliams. He's a relatively famous Irish economist, considered actually to be one of the most influential popular economists in the world. Um, and there's a whole intrigue about him having advised the Minister of Finance at the time to maybe like not do a blanket guarantee, or if you were, he says
Mhm.
he was clear. I think if I remember this correctly, he says he was pretty clear that part of this guarantee, if a guarantee was issued, would be to follow the Swedish model, which involves taking in the bondholders who basically provide the capital to the banks, which they then lend out, that they would have to take a haircut too. That everyone would have to kind of coordinate, but kind of take the hit together. That's not what happened. Instead, the entire debt was transferred onto the sovereign book, and it became a sovereign debt crisis. So it's a little different to the Greek crisis in that sense.
Well, that actually dovetails into the next question I have here.
Mm.
Let's talk about the response, in particular, the adoption of austerity policies, especially as Ireland was part of the Eurozone. I think most listeners will be aware of how this crisis played out in Greece, as you were saying, and debates surrounding the role of Germany in imposing
Hmm.
austerity on the country. How was Ireland's experience during this period of crisis?
That's a great question. So I think a lot of the Irish experience is connected with the early decisions I was talking about a moment ago, about around the way Ireland was developed. But then, as the crisis began, you get the government essentially making some fairly dramatic decisions to kind of afflict the costs of the crisis.
Bam.
Right. Okay. Here we're back. Okay. So I was saying that when the crisis hit, you know, it had been similar to the U.S. experience in some ways. It was like the flow of cheap global capital dried up,
Mm.
and as in a game of musical chairs, right? The when the music stops playing, there's going to be a credit crunch, and it's going to have a knock-on effect on the property sector in Ireland, especially. This had the effect of beginning a kind of a downwards negative spiral
Hmm.
in circumstances for the Irish economy and especially for the Irish government because it had leveraged so much of its ability to spend on public services on the tax take from the property sector. Um, as that sector collapsed and people became unemployed as a result, you know, property development, construction is labor intensive. So that's a lot of new people coming onto the unemployment roll from the construction sector and tertiary sectors that are dependent on it. And then you also have the tax take shrinking. So you have a kind of increase in government obligations to unemployed and a reduced tax take. And, that then on top of the fact that the banks were looking kind of very dicey at the time,
Hmm.
the government decided to do some fairly extreme things. And again, as I said a moment ago, there's this whole debate about communications between David McWilliams and the Minister for Finance at the time, Brian Lenihan, about other options. That's all for the history books, unfortunately. Maybe we won't ever know the full story of what happened there. But the long and the short of it is that the government ended up deciding to cover the entire loan basket, 400 billion, which is a huge amount of money for a small country like Ireland. I mean, that might not sound like much for the American government. I imagine the US economy probably spends that every day just on its military budget alone. But
Hmm.
but but by Irish standards, it's huge money. And there was no effort, as I said earlier, to negotiate with the bondholders. That's the rule in capitalism, right? Like you make a mistake, if you're a real believer in capitalism, you're Gordon Gekko. You make the mistake, then you eat the cost, and that's not what happened here. This was a kind of a weird, socialism for the rich kind of deal.
Hmm.
So now the public justification for this is that the problem was so bad that if the government didn't guarantee the loans, the the Main Street retail banking sector would collapse, and there was probably some truth to that. Um, so obviously, measures did have to be put in place to keep the economy going. Um, this is all very evocative of like the debates around the TARP in late 2008
Hmm.
here in the United States. But the interesting move was that the government kind of slyly swept in the big commercial bank that I mentioned earlier on, Anglo-Irish, and in doing so, then they were explicitly acting not just to protect the bondholders, some of whom were Irish, many of whom were European, but also to protect the credit worthiness, as it were, of their main donors, which are the farmers and property developers.
I was actually going to ask that. This
Oh
this
yeah,
seems like they're trying to protect, all this foreign investment that they've been getting for the last, at this point, probably almost
yeah,
20 years.
absolutely. So we could say a bit more sort of technically on this
Mhm.
about the creation of what they technically they went on to create then what was known as a bad bank, or NAMA, as it was called, the National Asset Management Agency. But the long and the short of it is the banks were effectively rewarded for their own gambling errors. And the government pretty soon realized, I mean, by 2010, it was very clear that uh, where were we? I had just talked about the creation of the big
Yes,
NAMA bank, the
yes.
the, the bad
Nama is the
bank
last
too.
thing you said, and that was
Yeah.
and it's like, "Nope."
Yeah. So that the idea there was to create a bad bank that basically would be owned by the people, as it were,
Mm.
and it was going to be full of bad debts, full of underperforming loans. So nice thing to have on your balance sheet as a nation. Became pretty clear that the cost of this was going to be something in the vicinity of 70 billion, which was
Jesus.
again huge money for a small
What is
country.
it for real
Uh,
quick, what is the
yeah.
population we're looking at of Ireland?
I think it's like in the Republic, I think it's just over 4 million now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty small. Um, and on the whole island, I think you maybe have 7-ish. I'll need to check that, but I think think it's 7 or maybe a little more. So,
Is it one of
um,
those 'cause I never got to go to Ireland when I was in that region touring some time ago. I was actually told not to go there.
you were told not to go there.
Yeah, yeah, they were like,
By
"Don't."
whom? I'll have words with them.
The label we were with at the time was like, "Ooh, don't know about that."
Huh. I think you would have enjoyed playing in Ireland. A lot of
I'm
bands
sure
go
it
to
would've been
Ireland.
fine, but
It's
I've been
good.
to other war-torn countries, it would've been fine.
People like to record live concert performances in Ireland, I've noticed. You can find a lot of people have played there and, released live recordings. Anyway, back to
Yes, yes.
back to the show. Um, so the Germany aspect of
Yes.
your question is interesting here because, and I think, not incorrectly, a lot of Irish left-leaning media made a big deal about how, austerity was being imposed on Ireland by the Troika, because, of course, Ireland has to turn to the Troika then. This 70 billion on the balance sheet is not something the country is going to be able to fix on its own. So there's going to need to be a bailout. The bailout's going to be conditional, but um, you know, the the interesting thing about that is, it's not strictly true that the austerity was mandated solely by the troika even before 2010. Through late 2008 and into 2009, the Irish government had been, imposing its own austerity. They had already put into place a strategy to cut 32 billion out of the economy, and I think
Wow.
they had achieved already about half of that by the time the troika arrived, and they did it largely. This is important, right? They did it largely by targeting public servants. Um, they introduced a major pension levy, I think 7 or 8% or something like that, on Irish public servant pensions. They cut their wages at varying rates, but generally between 15 and 20%. So every public sector worker in the country got a fairly major pay cut.
Even law
And then
enforcement.
I think about, hmm?
Even law enforcement.
I believe so, actually. And then 30,000 were laid off.
That's
But
massive.
maybe the law enforcement might have been, someone in the chat can correct me on this, but
Mm.
um, I think definitely they had their pay frozen.
This is insane. I mean, levying pensions is frightening.
Yeah, it really was. And I think people are still dealing with the aftermath of that.
And they're privatizing, certain social resources. Did they were they able to privatize the water as well?
Well, we can get to that
Oh, sorry.
later
Sorry if
on.
I'm skip
You're
sorry if
you're
I'm
fast.
skipping ahead.
No, no, no. You're fast forwarding to 2014 now with
Sorry.
that question. I think there's a couple of things to just address
Mhm.
before we get into that territory. And one of them is I think the question of why Irish people accepted this, because the protesting, there was a little bit of protesting, and we can talk about like Ireland's version of Occupy Wall Street. It's called
You
Occupy
s
Dame
so
Street.
I read you so you wrote about this, and
Yeah, a little, yeah.
I did read your paper about this, and this
Okay.
is where, this stuff gets interesting
Yeah.
to me
Mhm.
because you actually talk about culturally how this affected Ireland, and also I believe it was you that mentioned that Ireland historically has never really invested that much in its the social welfare of the state.
No. Yeah, there's a good economist in Ireland. He's a trade union economist, Michael Taft, and he writes a lot about this issue. As he always frames it, Ireland has historically a very low social wage, and what that means is that, um, there are unions in Ireland, and they have a certain amount of power, but they're not really powerful. Their role in Ireland, and especially with the public sector, has generally been to be partners with the government in what's called a social partnership model. And that's a kind of a non-adversarial wage bargaining structure that Ireland uses to kind of basically make sure that wages don't outpace inflation too much.
Mhm.
So um, this means that when a union comes to the table in Ireland, it's very much focused on a wage ask.
Mm.
Whereas, as Taft argues, really in the European context, in a mature European social democracy, the concept of wage is understood differently. It's not just the money that goes into your pocket; it's the money that you get in the sense of like a total basket of wealth that you have access to. That includes public services. So, for example, in Germany, very cheap access to childcare,
Mm.
highly subsidized, so that's considered part of your wage, that your social wage.
Mhm.
Very cheap access to public transportation, that's considered part of your social wage. Great healthcare, social wage. Education, you know, and Ireland just doesn't really have those things. Not really. We've always been quite far behind on those things. So, and again, that kind of just goes back to what I was saying earlier on about the fact that the country wasn't really founded in the kind of classic European model. It was founded in a civil war that led to the domination of two fairly conservative nationalist parties that primarily targeted the interests of their donor base, farmers, developers, bankers. Um, the amazing thing about it, and we can start to talk about the Ireland's Occupy movement in a minute, but I think the amazing thing about it was just how quickly Irish people kind of internalized that idea that it was their fault. There's a brilliant quote by Brian Lenihan, who I mentioned earlier on was the Minister of Finance at the time. And he said, the steps taken, this is a quote here, the austerity, in other words, the haircut,
Mm.
the steps taken have impressed our partners in Europe who are amazed at our capacity to take pain. In France, you would have riots if you tried to do this.
Mhm.
So
As we're seeing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so part I what I argue is that part of the kind of cause of this acceptance, and it's controversial. A lot of Irish people will push back on this and say, like, what are you talking about? There wasn't acceptance. But certainly there weren't major protests. And uh, I would argue, as I mentioned that taxi driver earlier on, there
Mhm.
was a sort of an internalized idea of, you wouldn't give money to a nation of gobshites, right? And people like David McWilliams, who I'd mentioned earlier, are sort of partly responsible for this because in earlier in the 2000s he'd written a book called The Pope's Children, which was a big hit. It's a reference to the fact that the Pope John Paul II visited Ireland in 1979, and the joke goes, the minute he visited, the birth rate just shot up, right? So like everyone became very Catholic overnight, and so Ireland's Gen X
Mm.
comes out of a major population boom that started in 1980, 1979, 1980. I was born in 75, just for reference. I'm an older Gen X
Mhm.
compared to most. But so, Gen X and then millennials really are kind of coming out of this population wave. And, these people did not grow up in their parents' Ireland, right? These people have access to wealth. They like cappuccinos. They have, champagne tastes.
Mhm.
And David McWilliams said at one point that Ireland had become a nation of economic bimbos. So, and I think that was kind of, uh, you know, to a certain extent, I think even the dogs in the street kind of agreed. It would be one way of looking at it. Now, of course, it doesn't stay that way, and eventually the Irish people are going to kind of turn around and start to protest. But they did, I think, in the first instance, internalize that very incorrect narrative that it was their fault, that it was their fault that the crisis happened.